And now we're going to move to the next part, which is a continuation of the study we were doing on judging God. And we're going to do it as an example this time because a person responded to the first video on there, and we're going to look at his response and study what we can get from that. And there's quite a bit that we can learn from that. If you remember then, I'll just do a really quick review here. We talked about the idea that many people don't realize that they are saying things that are judging God, or they are believing things that are judging God. And we talked about that in some different areas in there. I'm not going to go in any depth into that, but we can do that by finding fault with something God has done. But the problem is we never are honest with ourselves about what we're doing. We give ourselves different ways of saying it, so it doesn't sound like we're saying God has done something evil. Instead of saying I don't think God did anything good, I think he did something bad, we say I don't understand why God did that, or we say some other thing like that to try and hide the fact that we have a real problem with something God did in the Bible. And and uh, and sure, that's fair enough. There are some things you can say about the Bible I don't understand, and that's fine. I don't understand everything about death. I don't understand a whole bunch of other things in the Bible. But that's not judging when you say it that way. It's only judging when you are really, what you really mean is God did something evil, and I don't understand why he did something evil, because you've made that judgment of God in that. And we'll see an example here of what this person is doing and the discussion that went on with it. So, and we talked about this in that lesson. This is commonly seen in the liberal worldview in the church. So when you have liberals in the church, the liberal worldview, the natural humanist worldview, calls to them very strongly. And there are ideas that they come up with that are against God. They are not godly ideas at all. And we talked about some of the reasons for that. And one of those is that the liberal worldview is very sensitive to suffering of people. And so those stories of the slaughter of people when Israel was moving into the promised land, and the whole idea of eternal torment and slavery, all of those sorts of things that are a part of the Bible are really a big problem for any liberal because of their sensitivity to suffering. And we also talked about women as being equal, and Paul's writings are a big problem for people with a liberal worldview. And they see justice not the way we do, as being a corrective process. They see it as just something that causes more suffering in society. So they never see a judge's decision of throwing somebody in jail as being justified. They only ever see it as causing more suffering in society. And so because of these differences in the way liberals view the world, they wind up very commonly as being enemies of God because of the ideas that they've come up with. And so that comes to where we are with this person that we're going to be talking about here. What happened is while I was gone, that video was up there and somebody found it, someone who claims not to be a liberal, but certainly is. And he began to comment on that. And we went back and forth a few times on discussing that. And I was really doubtful that this could ever have any hope of making any progress with him, because that liberal worldview is so ingrained, as any worldview is in a person, that it's hard to shake that. And we'll see why and how that is that a person can believe in these liberal ideas and be at odds with God and be absolutely unable to give up those ideas, no matter what how they're explained or anything. So he uses some words that I want to make sure we understand here. He's going to use the phrase chattel slave. Now, a chattel slave is really nothing special in this country. That is what all of the black people were. A chattel slave is a person who was owned unconditionally as property, and therefore his children are going to be slaves just as he was slave, and the slavery continues on, and that's a chattel slave. What was different about the blacks, and we talked about that in the original lesson, is that black slavery in America was not what the Bible does for slavery. The Bible is very much against just grabbing up people and saying, there, now you're a slave, and you're going to be a slave forever. The Bible talks about slavery of different sorts, but not that kind of slavery. That one is a violation. And so it's important to understand that too. So how you became a chattel slave is important in the Bible. There are some people who became chattel slaves by their own choice. You could become have your ear pierced and become a person who was going to be a slave of another person for the rest of your life. And there are other cases like that. Captured prisoners in wars were sometimes made into slaves that way. And so all of those happen in the Bible, and the Bible doesn't say anything about those kinds of slavery. God has no problem with that. So, and that brings up our next word. He's going to use the word condone. And condone means to allow something bad to happen and to continue to happen. And he's going to say that God condones chattel slavery. And he's going to misapply this to God and the Bible. The Bible never says that the chattel slavery is bad, but he, because of his liberal worldview, is going to claim, and he believes very solidly that God is against chattel slavery. But you're going to see that he's mystified about why God never says anything against it, despite his quite being certain that God is against chattel slavery. So condone really means to allow something that you disagree with to happen and to continue to happen without any sort of punishment. And God doesn't condone in that way anything. God, if something is wrong, God will say, this is wrong, and I will allow you to make that decision, but there's a price to be paid if you continue to go down that road. And that's not what condone means. Okay, another idea that we're going to see is the idea of projection. And this is something that liberals do an awful lot. They will project what's inside of them onto other people. So their beliefs, they will project onto another person, for example. And we'll see that with this person projecting his ideas about chattel slavery and really his liberal worldview ideas about chattel slavery onto God. And he's going to be certain that God hates chattel slavery just as much as he hates chattel slavery. But he's going to, as I said before, he's going to be mystified because God never says anything against chattel slavery. And there are many, many opportunities where God could have said something, but he just never did. And so God has never spoken a word against that. So in the Bible, there is never a law against chattel slavery. There's never even a word said against it. And that's New Testament and Old. And there's never a punishment set up for that or even a threat of punishment that is mentioned for that. So you'd have to say that the Bible has no problem with chattel slavery. But this person you're going to see believes that God must hate chattel slavery because he hates chattel slavery.
So, is there another word for the chattel in the Bible?
That word isn't used. The Bible just says slavery. These are kind of modern definitions that people have used to distinguish one kind of slavery from another. Like there's indentured slavery and there's chattel slavery. There's a few different kinds like that. Yeah, the Bible just says slavery and doesn't really make any distinguishing.
Because there's the kind of slavery that if you couldn't pay somebody, that you have to work for them for 7 years. So that is one kind of slavery. The other kind is like you were talking earlier, they were conquered, they were taken over, they were forced to work for them and so forth.
Yeah.
There's a lot of different types of slavery.
Yeah. And the Bible just lumps them together as slavery. Okay, so what this person said, I'm going to shorten down his words a little bit so we can get through this pretty quickly. And it still won't be all that quickly. He says, I don't feel like I'm judging God when I point out that the Bible condones chattel slavery. And I don't understand why. If that's judging God, then I guess I am. I've been trying to understand this for years now. If asking the question, why does the Bible condone and never condemn chattel slavery is somehow judging God, then I guess I'm guilty, but I'd still like an answer. So what he's doing here is he's saying, I don't understand why God condones this, really. He won't say God condones this. He's only going to say the Bible condones this. And I'm the one who has to say that when you're saying the Bible condones this, you're actually saying God condones this. And so he's kind of being a little bit obtuse in his words. But the answer to his question is how his question is, we'll maybe reframe it a little bit into how is it judging God to to say something about chattel slavery here. And so that happens because you're saying that God condones chattel slavery, okay? And when you say that chattel slavery is evil, now that in a deductive argument, if you're familiar with how deductive arguments work, then you're saying God condones evil. And so that's the result of that very simple argument there. And God does not condone evil. That's a very anti-biblical definition or description. And I showed that to him and explained that to him, but he couldn't hear what I was saying, and we'll see why about that.
I think we need to clarify that you're talking about the lesson we upload into YouTube.
Yes.
Because I think a lot of people don't realize it. We're putting a lot of these lessons and sermons on YouTube, and people will comment on them and we respond to them that way.
Yeah, and we don't get that many comments most of the time, and some of them are just silly comments that I ignore. But this guy was actually trying to communicate something, so I did get involved in him, despite the fact that I really didn't believe there was going to be any way to have any progress with him. Okay, so in the liberal religion, which you could also call humanism, and so this is outside of the church now. They say, and one of its really fundamental tenets is that chattel slavery is evil. And they're just absolutely convinced that that is the greatest evil, or one of the greatest evils ever. But when a person who has this kind of liberal religion, this liberal worldview idea, but he's also in the church, he has to find some way to rationalize this into the teachings of the church. And so what he does is he projects this onto God. He's absolutely certain that God also believes that chattel slavery is evil. And so he's brought that into the church, and you will see him talk about God, and he does have a basic understanding of God, but he's still trying to figure out how to get these liberal ideas to fit in. And that's a wrong thing to do, of course. Those are worldly ideas. They're not biblically based. And he actually says that. He says in all of the Bible, when you look through it, there's just nothing that the Bible says against chattel slavery. But nonetheless, he's absolutely certain that God is against chattel slavery. So he's trying to understand why this is, that there's nothing in the Bible against this, because he's absolutely certain that God hates it as much as he does. And then so why wouldn't God have said something against this? And so because this is a liberal religion item, he can't question that. It's like a fundamental tenet in any religion. You can't question that. And so there's no way for him to say, well, maybe the thinking about chattel slavery is wrong. Maybe it doesn't line up with what the Bible teaches. He has this idea on chattel slavery, and he's not going to be able to give it up no matter what. And we'll see that that's going to be the final outcome here. So he's already determined that chattel slavery is evil, and not just any old evil. It's a really great evil. And so that leaves him with this conclusion that he's trying not to say that God condones evil, because he is trying to at the same time be some kind of a Christian. So he finds himself at war with what are godly values and what are worldly values from a liberal worldview. And so this is him, I'm repeating what he said there. He says, if asking the question, why does the Bible condone and never condemn chattel slavery, is somehow judging God, then I guess I'm guilty. And so the question he has, there's nothing wrong with. The question is fine, but the belief that chattel slavery is evil, when you know that God condones chattel slavery, is judging God. You are saying, in effect, that God condones evil, and God does not condone evil. And so he really isn't honest about himself with a lot of things, and we'll see that in multiple places here. He's trying to hide things that he knows are a problem, and he's won't admit to himself some things that should be obvious to him. Okay, so this is an important part to understanding his perspective on this, and this is not just him. Remember, he's really a good representative of the liberal worldview on this, and the whole chattel slavery thing, and how any liberal in the church is going to see this. And so he says, and I hate so much the argument that if you have a job, have to eat, are subject to a government with laws, or are in the military, then you're a slave. It's absolutely horrible and frankly insulting argument to those millions of people who were actual slaves throughout history. Could you honestly stand in front of an actual chattel slave who has never known freedom? whose wife and children are automatically slaves for life also? Who can be told at any time to another, oh, who can be sold, good, okay, who can be sold at any time to another person who does not get paid, who can be beaten, has no hope of earthly freedom, and say, yeah, I know how you feel, I have a job too, or have to eat? Are you really floating in the same boat? Can your employer sell you to a Nike factory in the Philippines for 2 goats? So you see this emotional argument that he's got out here, and he's trying to say that my arguments in there about a continuum of slavery. There are little bits of slavery that we all experience with our jobs when we give up control of our lives, and all the way up to a military where you sign onto a contract and they have a very great control of your life. I was talking about that in that lesson, and he rejects that. He says there's just nothing like that. Chattel slavery is something completely different and completely evil, whereas military service and those sorts of things are nothing like it. And so he wants to see the world in this perspective. And you see his all the emotional baggage and content here that he's got to back it up. And because of this, this sensitivity to the suffering of people, that's all that he can see. And I'll keep explaining to him different things, but he keeps coming back to this idea that this is such a horrible, horrible thing that therefore it must be a great evil, and therefore God must hate this evil, and therefore it's okay for him to say that God condones evil.
I just wanted to mention, first he's trying to understand God, and the Bible says that God's thoughts are our thoughts. There's so many things that we don't have a complete understanding that God is wiser and he's about, so he's not recognizing God's authority, and he's not recognizing the government authority. God gave authority to the government to do, for us to be under government and also obey the law and everything. So just discarding all of that.
Yes.
And trying to come up with his own way of thinking, which
yes, that is very much what he's doing. He wants to be a Christian, but he has all these other liberal ideas that are more important to him than what God says. And so these things are really crushing him. And in the end, what I tell him, you need to get rid of these ideas. They aren't godly ideas. They aren't Bible-based ideas. And you'll see where that goes.
And you mentioned Nike there. People can do a research a little bit on Nike. It says the Nike, along with many major U.S. companies, uses slave labor or sweatshop labor to manufacture products. They've been doing this for decades. So when I become aware of people like that, like companies like that, like Nike, I won't buy any of their products. Well, I mean, I don't buy anything like shoes or shirts, anything like that from them, because they're using slave labor, and yet they go around criticizing a lot of people, you know, about social rights and things like that. But in reality, they're employing these people, and these people are not getting paid. They're owned by other people.
Well, they do get paid in some fashion, or else they wouldn't.
Well, not very much, just enough to exist.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so moving on here. That argument of his is completely an emotional argument. And remember, we talked some time ago about the difference between a logical argument and an emotional argument. And so in an emotional argument, the idea is see how bad I feel for these people, and therefore you should feel just as bad for these people the same way I do. And so if you did feel as bad for those people as I do, then you would do what I want you to do. And so it tends to feel like manipulation. Someone is using your emotions to try to manipulate you into doing what they want you to do. And so whenever you're dealing with people, especially people who come to you with a liberal worldview, be prepared for that. You're going to get emotional arguments, strong, heartfelt emotional arguments that those are important arguments to them. They're not going to give those up easily. And you can make all the kind of reasons in the world that you want, but they're just not going to be able to hear those reasons. Okay, so he continues on. He says, please stop making this argument. You're doing with slavery what you probably hate about liberals doing with racism. If everything is racist, then nothing is racist. If everything is slavery, then nothing is slavery. So he actually says some interesting things in that. But what he's trying to do is he's trying to get me to self-censor. He wants me to stop doing something. And he doesn't like what I'm saying about a continuum of slavery from all the way from a job to being an indentured slave or whatever. And so, and this is a typical thing you'll see with liberals too, is they want you to stop saying what you're doing, and you're not allowed to have a different viewpoint. You can only have the one accepted liberal viewpoint. And if you start saying things that they don't like, then they will try to get you to stop saying those things. And another thing that he does here is he's attributing a liberal view of racism to Christians. He's once again taking liberal ideas and putting them onto Christians. And so he thinks that we should be the same kind of anti-racist crusaders that he is. But Christians are not that way. That's not what Christianity is about. We're not crusaders against religion. We don't even accept that idea can work. Fixing racism, it requires a change of the heart. And that's where you fix the problem there. And you can't stop someone from being a racist. You can't force them to change their inside that way. The only thing that can happen is that they need to change their heart. And so we see racism and the solution to racism being entirely different from him. He's on a crusade against racism, and he's going to try and force everybody to stop being a racist. And he's going to be the one who decides who is a racist. But you can't win that way. You never can. What you need to do is change that person's heart, and God does that. And so Christians say different things about racism than he does. He says, if everything is racist, then you are the racist. If you see racism everywhere, maybe the problem is you. Maybe you're the racist. And he wouldn't accept that, of course. We also say race doesn't matter to God or to us, and that's really fundamental Christian belief on racism. Is it doesn't matter to God, doesn't matter to us. We aren't involved in racism at all, never should be. So he once again, he's moving ideas from the liberal worldview, the humanist worldview, into the church by doing that. So Christians say slavery is a continuum. That's what I was teaching you. And he said he's heard this argument before, and he hates this argument, is that slavery is a continuum of loss of freedom. So when you have a job for 8 hours a day, out of that job, you are somebody else's, and you have to do the work that they've told you to do. And that goes all the way up to military, as I mentioned before. And in a sense there, the military can, not in a sense, in a real thing, the military can order you to go out and do something that they know is going to result in your death. And so you've really lost your freedom to a different scale there. But he doesn't want to see it that way. And so instead what he's done is he's created this great evil law called chattel slavery. And he sees it as being a special evil that's just unrelated to anything else. It's just a new thing, an evil that is existent in society and has to be stomped out. And so he doesn't agree with the idea that there's degrees of loss of freedom that each of us have in our lives. And he, because that would dilute the idea of chattel slavery being this special evil that he wants to see it as. And so he says the only real slavery is chattel slavery. Anything else is just something different, and he gives those different names so they don't sound like that. Now, we saw this kind of representation back in the Trump years, if you remember. Remember when they were talking about border walls being evil? And you would hear that all the time, that border walls are just evil. And you wouldn't, all of the media on that left side would talk about border walls and how they were so evil and how Trump was so evil for building these border walls. It's the same idea. They've created this thing that they've decided is evil, this border walls idea. And so back then I talked to some liberal friends about that, and I asked them, well, Jerusalem has a wall around it. Is that an evil wall? Well, no, that's not an evil wall. Well, China has the Great Wall of China, and that one keeps out people from the country just like any other border wall. Is that one an evil wall? Oh, no, that one's not an evil wall. And when you narrow it down, you find out that the only evil wall was the one that Trump was building on the border. and so, but that's the way the game works there, is that they declare this great special evil, and it becomes part of their religion, and they try to convince you to go along with that. So watch out for all these things when you're dealing with people.
Seems like rich liberals also have liberal walls all over their houses.
Yes, that too, yeah.
The ones that are against it, that they allow their own problems.
Yeah, hypocrisy runs thick in liberals. Okay, and one of his last comments is, I'm not even a liberal. And he plainly is what we would call a liberal, but he doesn't see himself as being a liberal. And that's because he is a liberal in the church. He believes in a God. And liberals outside of the church do not believe in that. Humanism doesn't accept any idea of a God, but he does. And so he's this kind of odd beast that isn't what we would think of as a total Christian, because he's mixed in a bunch of liberal ideas there. But he's also not the same as liberals who are not church-going, Bible-believing people of any sort. And so, and he says that word, and again, that's the kind of thing you often hear from liberals is words like that you wouldn't understand what they mean unless you can really have an opportunity to dig into it with them and figure out what they mean from that. But that is what he means here, is that despite the fact that everything he's said is coming from a liberal worldview, he doesn't see himself as being as the same as a liberal in society. So what happens is I tell him the problem here is that this idea of chattel slavery, this law that he's created, that he's applying to God, is something that he needs to get rid of. He needs to drop this idea. And I know that this is going to be impossible for him to do. This is going to be really, really hard for him to do because it's so much a part of liberal religion and it's just built into his nature. And I tell him that it's going to keep you from relating to God. It's going to be in your way all the time. And how can you ever move closer to God when you see him as doing evil? So if you see God as being a person who does evil, how can you ever move closer to him? How can you ever have a good relationship with him? And I tell him that, in fact, this makes him an enemy of God by treating God this way and saying that God condones evil. And so I also tell him that Satan uses these kind of things to pull people from the faith, and I've seen how that works. And just in fact, this very idea has been used by Satan to pull people out of the church. And so I give him all this information and stuff like this. I know he's not going to be able to accept that. So here's his last comment. He says, "So Pastor Joe," now I'm under Pastor Joe's name here, so it's not him, Pastor Joe, he's me, he's referring to by that name. He says, "You're saying that chattel slavery is not evil. Then I say that Satan has a hold of you. You have lost your way and will drive many other good Christians into the waiting arms of Satan. God will judge you for saying that chattel slavery is not evil, that you have let yourself be deceived and worse, tried to lead others into this immoral deception. Shame on you for saying chattel slavery is not evil." So what he actually did there was he contradicted his understanding of condone. He said earlier that God condones chattel slavery, and he didn't understand why. Condone means that God allows it to happen and doesn't punish for it. But now he's quite determined that God will indeed punish me for having said that chattel slavery is not evil. And that's very typical. There is no way for him to give up that idea that chattel slavery is evil. That's just embedded in liberal belief in humanism so much that he can't give that up. And we've talked about liberals in the church many times before, and they have a lot of ideas like that they can't give up. They are just embedded in their very roots. The fabric of their being contains these ideas, and is unnatural for them to even think of that idea of giving up these things.
So if he hunts me down and shoots me, then we'll blame you for it.
No, but
that kind of reminds me of Jeroboam. You know, he just make his own gods and try to worship and change it, and make his own thing, but then he pays the consequences. Instead of giving recognition to God, he makes his own idols and make people do it.
Yeah, and this is a big problem in the church right now. I've talked about this so many times, is people bringing outside ideas into the church and putting them on God, saying, I'm sure that God believes this, even though the Bible doesn't say anything about that. And it becomes a real problem in the church. You get a whole bunch of ideas that aren't biblical, and you begin viewing God differently because of that. And in the end here, this guy has gotten to the point of saying that God condones evil because of his belief here. So I hope you got something from this. You understood a little bit of how the liberal mind works and how that liberal worldview generates these ideas that end up being ideas that judge God, find fault with God. And you see how these ideas get into a Christian church and into a person who considers himself a Christian. This person, because of that liberal worldview, he is holding on to ideas from other liberals in the world, and he's bringing those into the church because it's so much a part of his nature to do that. And so that's how the church becomes polluted with these ideas, because they're brought in by people who strongly hold on to them. And you can see how strongly he holds on to these ideas. And so, and we see how people with that worldview will just not give up those ideas. You can explain to them all you want about this is going to interfere with your relationship with God. You can tell them all those kinds of things, but no, they're going to hang on to this idea and they're not going to give up this idea. And we also see how people will choose the words that they use to describe these situations that they put God into. And they'll find some way to not say it directly because they know that they shouldn't be saying it. They know it'd be wrong to say that God does evil. And so they find different ways to say it and to avoid the fact that really that's what they've done inside of themselves. And they just don't want to say it in words. And also understand, and I think you understand so much how suffering is as a moral, it's their only moral value, really. And we did a study long ago about the liberal moral values. And the only real moral value they have is human suffering. And so that calls out to them very strongly. And it's the basis for a lot of their thinking. And so a lot of their reasoning is emotional reasoning rather than logical reasoning. And we saw that with what he was saying is all of these emotional things that he felt about this situation were the things that guided him. And he wasn't dealing with it logically at all. And notice and remember also that he wanted to stop freedom of expression. He wanted to keep people from saying things that he didn't want them to say. And that's something you commonly will see is people trying to control you and get you to shut up and not say what you should be saying. And we see that with so many things now in society that are different from what the church believes. And so we find ourselves almost continually having to speak up and give the biblical view and explain to people that the things that are going on in society are not acceptable to God. And they also project their ideas onto others. We saw that in many places with him. He was projecting his ideas onto God and onto other Christians. And so watch for that always, is that they often take the idea of, well, you seem like a sensible person, therefore you must believe the same things that I do. And don't be dragged into that, because often, although they will say words that sound good, they're not good words.